Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Jamie Ingram, Senior Editor at the Middle East Economic Survey, which has long been the sort of anchor newsletter of the Middle East, if not global, oil industry. 50, 60 years now it must be, but at once upon a time, and for many still a must read every week. Jamie, thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Sean. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to a good morning's discussion.
Thanks, mate. Let's kick off with the sort of news of the day, news of the week, really, and take a slightly deeper look into it. I mean, where these intersection points of Ukraine war into energy, into the Middle East, and also the Saudi and Yemen conflict that is ongoing. The world's two biggest oil exporters, Saudi Arabia and Russia, have themselves caught in fairly thorny wars that will be difficult to get out of, and we're seeing. Let's kick off with Saudi, because of course that's more our neighborhood. Saudi Arabia now many years into a conflict in Yemen, and we're seeing increasingly their foes in Yemen, the Houthi rebels, the Houthi army, if you want to call it that, with increasing military capabilities, sending rockets deep into Saudi Arabia and most recently also into the UAE. And over the weekend, we saw them hit a oil storage depot near Jeddah. Your thoughts on that? What is that a message? Is that just the Houthis? Is the Iran behind it? Is it a bigger geopolitical message? How do you read this sort of regional politics of that?
Yeah, well, it's good that we're talking on such a quiet week as this, Sean. Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia last week sent a very pointed message out. They didn't hold back at all. They firmly pointed the finger at Iran. They didn't just say it was Houthi rebels in Yemen. They said, I think, in three separate points in their original message, Iranian backed. They very much called on the international community to do something about this. It was a quite extraordinary message. Typically what we expect to hear from Riyadh is that, this isn't too big a problem. We are the most reliable supplier of oil to global markets. We'll handle it. No, this time around, they chose very clearly to say the international community needs to step up here. We cannot be held accountable for if these Iran-backed Houthi attacks cause outages that ultimately have a big impact on global supply-demand balances. Really quite an extraordinary break from tradition there. And then it wasn't just a one-off. It's been repeated on multiple occasions since, the most recently by the Minister of Energy, Prince Abdulaziz himself, speaking earlier today. So clearly this is a unified government position. It wasn't just a one-off statement by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think. And
who are they communicating with ultimately, do you think, on this point? I mean, the idea that there's two things happening. They're in this conflict. The Houthis are causing more and more problems for them. And at the same token, the world and the West in particular are facing $110, $20 oil, looking for more supply from Saudi Arabia.
I think you have to say that the message is for the US, really. I mean, it comes at a quite unprecedented time. And as you say, we've got two of the world's largest oil producers involved in these conflicts. I mean, Russia, global number 2, 3, wherever you want to put it, it's invaded another sovereign state. It's being imposed, having massive financial sanctions imposed on it, and a lot of Western buyers simply, for reputational reasons, self-sanctioning effectively. Then we have, the IEA saying that this could be the biggest supply shock in decades and generations. Then this is all coming at the same time as we have the Iranian nuclear talks, kind of looking as if we might be reaching an end game there. And frankly, you have the Saudis saying, well, hang on, to the US, you've been saying that you want us to increase production. Now it looks as if you're about to do a deal which will unlock billions of dollars for the same guys who are threatening our own oil production facilities. What are you going to do about this? I mean, if you really are that concerned about us increasing our production, surely at the minimum, you should be making sure that what we are currently producing now isn't under threat. But then what do they want to get out of it? That's the big question here. I mean, I think that you cannot decouple this from the the Iranian nuclear discussions. Clearly, I think they're looking for some sort of safeguards within whatever sanctions are lifted, that whether it be the IRGC in Iran won't have any sanctions lifted from them, or whether it will just be that there is more recourse for snapback of sanctions in case of further Iranian misbehavior.
Or indeed, are they looking for, I mean, all of the above perhaps, but how to extract themselves from Yemen, this war that won't go away, this conflict that won't end, and the Houthis seem to be emboldened with the ability to fling missiles all across the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah.
I mean, this has been going on since 2014, 2015 now. It's quite incredible how long this has been going on for, and it's a morass. Is there a way out for Saudi Arabia at the moment? I'm not sure that. I can't see an easy way for them to back down without losing face. And the Houthis, I mean, they've just really stepped up their ability to target at will, and not just, they're not just flinging missiles. I mean, this is accurate. I mean, they are actually managing to hit facilities, and you have to assume that the more practice they get, the better they're going to get at this as well. Yes, they've hit Jeddah, they've hit Shukaik, they've hit Yanbu, and then just across the border we've got Jazan. I mean, that's a big refinery that the Saudis are building there, well, have built, that they're doing test runs at. It's operating about 50% capability at the moment. It's maybe 60 kilometers away from the Yemeni border. I mean, that's just a red flag for anybody that wants to be demonstrating their capabilities at the moment.
Well, there's a kind of a sense that if a deal is done with at the nuclear talks in Vienna between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, which of course does include Russia and China, as well as the US, Britain and France and Germany on that as an adjunct as well. So if a deal is done there, there's a kind of a narrative then Iran is vested to sort of calm down the Houthis and sort of ease off what they're doing at the moment. Is that a sort of naive posture, a naive narrative? What do you think that plays out?
I think definitely the Saudis and the Emiratis would say that it is naive. I mean, they would say, look at what happens during the last period after the JCPOA itself, around 2016 to 2018, when sanctions were lifted, and they would say that the Iranians, okay, it wasn't the Houthis, but that they were really stepping up their support for proxy groups in Syria and Iraq, and they say that this frees them up to do exactly the same again, to spread their influence, and that this time around they could do similar with the Houthis as well.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And this deal that does seem a little bit like waiting for Godot, it never arrives in Vienna. It's always sort of, like a shadow you can't quite get your hands on. We also had this week comments from the UAE minister, which were probably ahead of the OPEC meeting this week, which of course our interview is also sitting ahead of the OPEC meeting this week, where the UAE sort of made it quite specific that they would not be breaking away from Russia in OPEC plus, that whatever is going on in Europe, it will not fracture this OPEC plus group.
Yeah, I mean, OPEC, they've towed a very consistent line throughout their history, really. They say that we don't bring politics across the threshold into the meetings. They'll point to the Iran-Iraq war, they'll point to the Iraq-Kuwait conflict, and they'll say, look, we had ministers sat down next to each other discussing technocratic issues in the oil markets, despite these conflicts going on between them. And it's exactly the same with Russia. That is fundamentally the most difficult element of all of this, is that they've put a lot of effort into building this relationship with Russia. What they're being asked to do now is basically replace Russian barrels. How can Russia accept that and still be part of this agreement? It's almost politically unthinkable that OPEC Plus could survive such an arrangement. If
you look at that from the sort of technocratic point of view, putting aside all these conflicts, we do have this meeting on this week with OPEC Plus. They are looking at the idea of the OPEC Plus are looking at increasing quotas now, because this is the part of the stage in the agreement for May, which is what this meeting this week will focus on. May supply, which is already embedded in the agreement for that to incrementally increase for a few countries. But ultimately, the group is getting closer and closer to the fact that this deal expires in the next few months, this sort of rebuilding of the COVID collapse in supply. It does have an end date. What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best case scenario that the ministers will be hoping for is basically that any collapse in Russian output and exports is gradual. You know, a lot of what's being sold at the moment is under long-term contracts that it's difficult to get out of. If they can just kind of get across the finishing line into September before millions of barrels come off the table from Russia, everybody can walk away happy. You know, they don't want this deal to disintegrate. If they can get to the finishing line and be okay, the market's recovered from COVID, this was the plan, now we're here, we'll continue to be friends, but nobody's breaking any agreement with anyone. That would be the best case scenario for them. It's pretty optimistic. As you say, things are changing from May. I mean, we've got a whopping increase from 400,000 barrels a day to 432,000 barrels a day coming online each month now, which I don't think that's going to be enough to quite settle the markets. But
well, they're not even reaching the 400. It does seem kind of, yeah, before Russia. It does feel like we're in really a technical, ordinarily automatic monthly press release here without it having any real teeth left. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Europe and this obviously massive disruption, this massive conflict and fairly vicious one taking place in the Ukraine. Let's talk about the energy restructuring that is going on. A lot of reporting about the war itself, and we're not really equipped to, we're not on the ground, we don't know the details, but there's lots of it every day in all the news channels. But in terms of the energy restructuring, you know, like 50 years ago, we saw after the 1973 war between Israel and the Arabs, there was a lot of realignment after the Arab embargo that stopped sending oil to the West. We saw the creation of the IEA, much more efficient fuel car that started the trend of efficient fuel engines, a big sort of change. A lot of the oil and gas energy that used to go west stopped going west and started moving to east. On this occasion, we're starting to see a restructuring. Everybody in Europe scrambling for new energy supplies. I mean, I don't know how they found themselves in this situation of so dependent on one energy supplier, regardless of politics. You just would never do that. It just seems in the rearview mirror illogical. But how do you see this restructuring, the pace of it, the credibility of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the IEA, because they've obviously been very active recently in terms of publishing kind of roadmaps to how to reduce Europe's reliance on Russian oil and gas. Gas is, of course, the big one. Everybody knows that. And Germany, as you kind of alluded to there, being the real poster child for becoming overly reliant on Russian gas. Effectively, they were saying try to reduce consumption through various economy measures. And then if you do have to use gas, try and buy it from someone else from Russia. Well, there's limits to how much you can do on that front. We saw an interesting agreement between, the US and EU saying, the US is going to increase supplies by 15 BCM, I think, per year over their original plan to Europe. I mean, their LNG capacity is already maxed out, really. Understandably, all those private companies, they're looking at this and thinking, yeah, we can make a lot of money now. So they haven't been holding back. So they can probably increase supplies to Europe, but realistically, that's through just pricing mechanisms. Prices are very high in Europe, so let's sell to Europe. And that means a bit of a shortfall to other markets that they would have been selling into. I think on the bigger picture, clearly energy security and the energy transition, those are the buzzwords at the moment. And people are definitely saying the biggest flaw of the current system is that we're reliant on imports of oil and gas at all. What can we do to move away from that? Well, solar, wind, that's something that people will talk up as alternative.
Which has already been in the mix, obviously, whether the capability to accelerate that any extent at which you could bridge at least some of the Russian supply?
I think that this will give more public momentum towards it, because beforehand, it was more of a morality issue. Yes, I love the planet. I want to save the planet. I'm going to go down the renewables route. But now if you can sell it as this is about national security as much as anything else, then that's another lever that you can start pulling. But clearly that's decades away, realistically, isn't it? We're going to be reliant on oil and gas for the foreseeable future. And it's interesting, the Germans, they were in the region recently. They were in the UAE, they were in Qatar, they were talking about hydrogen from the UAE, Qatar. This was about more firmer German commitment to building a couple of new LNG import facilities. So that's where we're looking.
Which is a conversation that's been on for a number of years, and the Germans have kind of reneged on it, and the Qataris have been a little bit wary.
The wording of that Qatari press release on it was quite fascinating, actually. I mean, they were, okay, it was reading between the lines, but they were very critical of German policy and the kind of flip-flopping within German policy. I think that given the current situation, yes, Germany's going to go down the LNG import route. I think it's inconceivable that they won't, given the political issues with with Nord Stream 2, everything to do with Russia. And clearly Qatar stands as the biggest supplier going forward. But again, when's their new capacity coming online? It's 26, it's 27. This is 5 years down the line. What are we going to do in the next winter, the winter after that?
Given the energy security point you just made and the sensitivities around that in Europe, there's the green sensitivities did a very strong block on shale being explored in the UK, for example, sort of the wind down of the North Sea, all of the majors pulling out there. Could we see with this new sort of urgency and around energy security that some of those sort of old chestnuts could be revisited?
Possibly, but I think that when you've got energy companies telling people to buy woolen jumpers and sending out thick socks in the post, as they did earlier this year in the UK, I think that those kind of get subsumed by issues of, well, hang on, yeah, I do want to save the planet, but also I don't want to freeze to death next winter. So it's all about providing that near-term energy security, and frankly, that has to be from oil and gas. It takes a long time to build solar, which I wouldn't want to rely on in a British winter, to build wind, and then where else for heating itself? Well, that's gas. We're not going to be installing loads of heat pumps over the next 12 months, I think.
It's really kind of now a race against time vis-a-vis next winter in a way, isn't it? I mean, this winter has delivered a fairly mild period, and this could have been a lot more of the energy shortage, the energy crisis that Europe faced could have been a lot more overt, but was saved in a way by the mildness. But now it's a race against time for next winter.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody's going to be desperately trying to fill up their gas storage facilities this summer, basically, which means that if you're expecting a lull in LNG prices, European gas prices in July, August, probably think again, because that's when people are going to be buying to prepare for next winter.
Which they've kind of messed up on last year and didn't do that. And also, obviously, the need for much greater storage. Let's lift the lens a bit and go global in our thinking at this current moment. China's position vis-a-vis Russia and the Ukraine conflict, its relationship with Washington, and then, of course, connection into the Middle East. But let's just kick off with where China's at the moment. It does look like they're having a little bit of a wobble from a demand point of view. We had a commentator on earlier in the quarter in January at our forum who said, actually, China had already reached peak oil demand. People thought he was a bit crazy, but in retrospect, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, just on the short-term perspective, again, if you're OPEC plus, the latest Chinese lockdown has probably come at a very opportune moment, because this gives them the opportunity to put out the message, well, hang on, we haven't finished with COVID yet. We're seeing lockdowns across China. That's hitting near-term demand very clearly. So that, OPEC plus is saying we need to still have contingency plans for the return of demand shocks. But then, yeah, on the longer term, I mean, it's not just oil demand, it's gas demand as well. I think that that's really been ratcheting up at an incredible pace. China became the world's largest LNG importer, last year. Really just incredible increase in the pace of LNG imports there. But now with prices the way they are, clearly fuel switching comes into play there. So are we going to see a bit of a resurgence in Chinese coal demand that's been somewhat overshadowed by the rush to LNG?
Well, it looks to me also in this sort of big wheel of time, right? The 30 years of growth that we've come out of, or just finished, where China essentially became the consumer of the marginal barrel, and every year more and more, ultimately to drive a construction boom, the building of everything, highways, railways, apartment buildings for as far as the eye could see, just construction. And that era, with the sort of implosion of the Evergrande real estate company, the whole construction machine that is the 30% of the Chinese economy now seems to be, at least they're keeping a brave face on it, but it does look like that is the Achilles heel of the sort of mid to longer term growth horizon for China and for oil demand.
100%. I mean, we're really seeing something of an economic slowdown in China now. And that's why I think that, talk of this great global realignment, that China is going to really double down on its relationship with Russia and, turn its back on the US, is somewhat overblown, because the Chinese economy, given the slowdown there, the last thing this Ukraine conflict has come at the worst possible time for them. I mean, it's massively ramping up pre-existing problems with global inflation. We talk about Chinese everything for the domestic market, but also huge exports. Well, those are looking shaky now, given the global economic straits. So yeah, that's going to have an impact on Chinese oil demand as well, just the slowdown of the global economy.
And for a country that is relatively, and for a culture that's relatively risk averse, the idea of kind of jumping on the back of the Putin Bronco wild horse of unpredictability, I don't know, it just seems like a marriage not made in heaven, and I just don't see how that sustains.
Yeah, I'm glad that, I have to say I agree with you on that front. I think does China want to see Putin fail? No, absolutely not. But are they going to tie themselves to Putin at the same time? No. They will, of course, they'll give support to Russia, but I think they've got some red lines in their minds with the US that they just don't want to cross. It's not worth it for them. I mean, given the current state of the economy, why would you put yourself in a position where you're exacerbating these problems by really setting a light talk of global realignment?
And when you look at that and just sort of wrap up our chat together, this idea of where did the Arab Gulf states and the Middle East go with all of this? They've got the sense of, US sort of withdrawing from the region, or at least that's a perception, a narrative that's bedding in here. You got China, yes, very happy to do business with everybody, but not necessarily a security replacement. We're seeing these new alignments, and most spectacularly this week with the photo op of Israel and the Arab states standing together with the US Secretary of State. How do you see that playing out, this sort of new security alignments in the Middle East?
I think that you touched on the key, fundamentally the key issue there when you said that China is not going to be a security replacement for the US. If we're seeing Riyadh and Abu Dhabi aggrieved over the supposed lack of security support from the US in dealing with these Houthis, well, good luck having China stepping in and providing anything like the same level of security guarantees. China, as you say, risk averse. They try not to get involved in these conflicts, disputes between countries and various organizations. So that's not going to happen. I think that the real bellwether, I think, for Chinese Middle Eastern cooperation is Iraq, in my view. We see China, they've taken on a lot of oil and gas assets in Iraq. They're also just taking on infrastructure projects across the board. I mean, refineries, roads, airports, you name it, they're building it. How's that going down in Iraq? Not particularly well. There's a lot of opposition growing from within the political groups, MPs challenging the government for, basically selling out to China on a lot of these projects. So that's something that's, you look at that happening in Iraq, it probably says that we're not going to see that level of Chinese dominance coming into infrastructure developments within the GCC state. And then you also, one of the big issues with Chinese companies that they then like to subcontract out to Chinese companies, and they like to have the workers coming in from China for these projects. How does that mesh within Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other GCC states where there's such a drive to boost employment of citizens? Local content.
In-country value is the new buzzword.
Yeah. How does that align with Chinese requirements for projects? So yeah, I don't see China coming in and replacing the US.
Well, we come to the end of the first quarter. We've had oil prices average this quarter, Jamie, $100 a barrel, more or less, give or take. I think just below at this stage. If I were looking in your crystal ball, your last comments to share with us, how do you see the oil price on Brent going in the second quarter?
Do you know what? I don't want to put a figure on it, but what I will say is it's going to be volatile. Volatility is very much back in vogue at the moment. And we can see price shifts of $10, $20 a barrel just within a single day. And if anything, I see that worsening in Q2.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot depends on where the conflict in Ukraine goes. Every headline is nearly a $2 or $3 move in one direction or another. And the oil traders will certainly need very robust credit lines to navigate this period. But listen, we have to wrap it up there. Jamie Ingram, senior editor at the Middle East Economic Survey, thank you so much